and welcome to Crimes Through Time, your weekly snapshot of crime history. On the 10th of February 1918, the body of Nellie Trew was found on Eltham Common. She had been violated and strangled. Two key pieces of evidence were found at the scene, a badge and a coat button. It would be these items, and very little else, that would lead to the arrest and conviction of David Greenwood, a 21-year-old discharged soldier. Detective Inspector Francis Carland would write in his memoirs of how certain he was that he'd got his man. But what do you think? Let's explore the Eltham Common murder and decide if there was a miscarriage of justice. Nellie Trew was described as an attractive and well-built girl, aged 16. She worked as a junior clerk in Arsenal. She lived with her parents in Eltham near Woolwich, and on the 9th of February she left home to go to Plumstead Library, which involved a short walk over Eltham Common. When she failed to return home by midnight, her father raised the alarm with the police. Search parties scoured the area, but she wouldn't be discovered until the morning. She was found on Eltham Common. She had been intimately assaulted and strangled. Next to Nellie, a military-style badge of the Leicester Regiment with their distinctive tiger emblem and a bone overcoat button. They had been threaded together through two holes with a piece of wire. There were no eyewitnesses of Nellie that evening. She didn't make it to the library. Inquiries about Nellie's habits, friends, and any love interests came to nothing. Inspector Brown of the Woolwich Police Force reached out to Scotland Yard for support with this seemingly unsolvable case. Detective Inspector Francis Carland took over the case 4 days after Nellie was found. His first action was to have the photographs of the badge and button sent to the press. He requested that every newspaper in Britain publish the photos and the details of the crime, and asked their readers to come forward if they recognised the items. Ted Ferrell, one of the turners at Hewson Manufacturing Company, showed the newspaper to his co-worker David Greenwood. The military badge was the same as one that Ted had seen on David's lapel. He also knew that David didn't have the badge anymore. He had told him he had recently sold it to a man he met on a tram for 2 shillings. Ted encouraged David to go to the police. David called into Tottenham Court Road police station. He told them the badge was his, but during a journey on the tram between Eltham and Wellhall, he had met a man and he had bought the badge from him. The officer took the information along with his name and address, but did not detain him. A telephone message was sent to Carlin at Scotland Yard, who instructed Inspector Brown to go to the Hewson factory and to bring David to Scotland Yard for interview. By the time he arrived 2 hours later, the police had uncovered that David was once Nellie's neighbour at Wellhall, where she and her parents lived. David was brought into Carlin's office, where the badge and button were laid out on the desk between the men. Here is a quote from Carlin's memoirs, Reminiscences of an Ex-Detective, detailing this interaction. I examined Greenwood's face closely, and then my eyes ran over his clothing, and I saw that his overcoat hung open, and there was not a single button on it. Where buttons would have been, threads were sticking out except in one place. That place was where the top button should have been, and instead of the tags of thread, there was a large hole, as if the button which had been there had been very forcibly torn off. I rose from my desk, picked up the button, which had been found beside the body of Nellie Trew, and walked over to Greenwood. I took his coat and applied the button to the large hole in the top. It fitted, and if one can use the expression here, exactly. I said nothing and asked him no questions, but I told him to wait in another room, and I gave instructions that he should be closely guarded, although of course he was not technically in custody. Now I must digress for a moment here to impress one thing on my readers. I can hear some of you say that I had already got clear and ample proof that I had found the murderer. From a CID point of view, I had nothing of the kind. To have charged Greenwood and put him up for murder with no more evidence than that would have meant for certainty that he would have been discharged. From here, Carlin knew David to be guilty, and he constructed his case in order to prove it. The police interviewed 6 of David's co-workers. From these conversations, Carlin was able to establish that on the 9th of February, the day of the murder, David had left work at the factory wearing the badge and with all the buttons on his coat. It was also disclosed that Ted had actually threatened David when he saw the badge in the newspaper. At first, David denied that the badge looked anything like his, and the two got into a heated exchange, ended with Ted telling David, quote, "You've got to go to the police station and tell them that this is your badge that's in the photo. If you don't go, I'll take you there myself." Different from the light-hearted suggestion that David had described it as. Carlin was also able, with the help of the works manager, to identify that the wire used to hold the button and the badge together was a particular type of wire specially made for Hewson's, for the aeroplane fitting work that they carried out there. From the factory, Carlin and the police went to David's home, which he shared with his mother, brother and sister. Each member of the family was interviewed. His mother said that his coat had been without buttons for some time, that as David was quite thin, he preferred to wear his coat open to appear more squarely built. He left home around 10 p.m. and went to the YMCA eating house in Woolwich without his coat. His mother remembered this detail because it was cold and she had encouraged him to wear it. He then returned sometime after 11 p.m. This, in the main, was supported by his brother and sister. A witness was found at the YMCA that shared a table with David. They hadn't met previously and had chatted till around 11:30 p.m. The man noted that David looked presentable with no mud or blood on his clothes. It would be impossible for the killer not to be covered in mud, given how wet the ground was that night. Carlin would dismiss the statements of David's family as just loving relatives of a person being investigated for a crime that could cost them their life, and doing whatever was necessary to try and save them, no matter what they had done. He said he had been at home for most of the evening before going out without his coat at around 10 p.m. for something to eat. He denied ever being at the crime scene. Then David did a curious thing. He picked up the button which lay on the desk in front of him and asked Carlin, quote, "If I say this is my button, what will it mean?" Carlin replied, quote, "I cannot tell you." David looked him straight in the eye and said, quote, "Well, I won't say it then." An officer then transported David to Cannon Row police station. Sometime later, Carlin visited him in his cell to inform him he was going to be charged with the outrage and willful murder of Nellie Trew. This was carried out formally at Woolwich police station. David looked pale and could only breathe a yes to accept the charges. The trial opened in the Old Bailey in April 1918. Mr. Justice Aitken presided. Sir Travers Humphreys was Crown Counsel, and Mr. Slessor acted for the defence. The prosecution painted a picture of a man waiting on the common for a woman to assault when Nellie crossed his path. They struggled, and to quiet her he put his hands around her neck. Nellie, fighting for her life, ripped the badge and button from David's coat, ripping a hole. The defence countered by laying out David's alibi, first at home with his family and then at the eating house. They told the jury that David had sold his badge and it therefore could not be him. Another point the defence put forward was outlined when Travers Humphreys was cross-examining the pathologist on the case, Sir Bernard Spilsbury. This was one of his earliest cases, 5 years before he arrived at the Crumbles cottage to recover Emily Kay. If you haven't seen my video on that case, I will have it linked in the description. David had been recently discharged from the army on medical grounds after serving in World War I. He suffered from a disordered action of the heart and fainting fits. They proposed that this meant that David couldn't physically inflict the injuries found on Nellie. However, Spilsbury couldn't say for certain that a man with such medical conditions would not be able to do so. The jury deliberated for 3 hours on the 28th of April 1918 before returning a guilty verdict. The foreman added, quote, "In view of the youth of the prisoner, his service to his country, and his previous good character, they desired to recommend him to mercy. As was customary, the judge asked if David had anything to say before sentence was passed against him. He replied, quote, "I wish your lordship to take no notice of the recommendation of the jury, as rather than face the disgrace, I would pay the full penalty for this crime." He then declared his innocence again. The judge addressed him, quote, "You have been found guilty of a most heinous crime. You have taken your unfortunate victim's life, and for that crime there is only one penalty." At the same time, I shall forward the recommendation of the jury to the proper authorities, where I have no doubt it will receive every consideration. It is not right, however, that you should anticipate that the course of the law will necessarily be interfered with on account of that recommendation." He then donned his black cap and passed the sentence of death. The recommendation of the jury was in fact taken into consideration, and on the evening before his scheduled execution, the Home Secretary commuted his death sentence to life in penal servitude. David Greenwood would go on to be pardoned on the 29th of March 1933, due to his young age and military service, and released. The badge and button can be viewed at Scotland Yard's Crime Museum. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below if you think David was guilty of this crime, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.